Hello, this is Evan Rogerson, also known as 9 Motor Gang, and this is my VEX gear ratio and wheel size tier list. To start with, we have 2.75-inch wheels running 400 RPM. Now, the spacing for this is a little bit weird. It's 72 to 36, I believe, on green motors, which means that you have your larger gear not on your wheel shaft, so it's going to be very bad for anything that involves climbing. The speed for this is also pretty slow. Just the spacing on it gets very clunky, especially if you want to stack them, or it ends up being pretty long. So I'm going to put these as a D tier RPM. Next, we have 2.75-inch wheels, 450 RPM. Now this is one of my personal favorite gear ratios. The spacing on it is really nice. It's 36 to 48, so very compact. You can easily do this as an 8-wheel drive and still have plenty of space left over. Also has a really nice speed. No one's going to say it's too fast. No one's going to say it's too slow. It's also offset, which makes it nice if you want to climb over things because you can give yourself an extra quarter inch of clearance. So I think this is worthy of an S tier. Next up is 2.75-inch 480 RPM. This gear ratio is very similar to the 2.75-inch 450 RPM ratio. It is 48 to 60, a lot of the same pros to it. Really, they're not that different from each other, so I'm also going to give this one an S tier. Next, we have 2.75-inch 600 RPM. This is kind of a weird gear ratio. It's definitely on the faster side. A lot of teams will run it and say that it's too fast. However, I think the fact that you can run direct drive makes up for this fact. In terms of convenience, you won't have to stack motors. It's also really nice if you're doing 8-motor drive. And this is pretty much the fastest speed anyone will want to run. But I think just the convenience of being able to not have to do gear ratios or to do gear ratios at whatever spacing you want, its versatility, I believe, makes it also an S tier. Next up is 3.25-inch wheels on 333 RPM. This is 60 to 36 as a gear ratio on green motors. Again, it's a green motor drive, so it's not going to be as good if you want to climb because your bigger gear is going to be on a different shaft than your wheel. However, this one still has a decent amount of clearance on it. The spacing on it for an 8-wheel drive is also pretty nice, and you could also run 36, 60, 60, 60, 36, which also gives you a nice spacing to work with. So I think it's a little bit better than the 2.75 400, but again, it's still a little bit slower, so probably a C tier. Next is 3.25-inch wheels, 360 RPM, which is on blue motors, 36 to 60. I really like this ratio. I find it's easy to build with. It already comes with low strength gears, so if you want to go for the 3-hole gap, it's pretty easy, but it is definitely on the slower side at higher levels of play, so I think it can only get up to A tier. Next is 3.25-inch 400 RPM. This gear ratio is a bit bulkier than some of the other ones as it uses 48-tooth and 72-tooth gears, but it does have a pretty nice speed. I think it has a lot of the pros and cons of the 3.25-inch. However, you can't automatically have the low strength gears and you'll have to cut those down or bevel the edges if you want to make this a 3-hole gap. So I think just for that extra downside, it goes into B tier. Next is 3.25-inch wheels, 450 RPM. Again, this is a pretty nice gear ratio. It uses the same layout as 2.75-inch, 450 RPM, except you just use a different wheel size. It does make it a little bit tighter, and this one's definitely getting on the faster side. You'd probably be better off running something like 2.75-inch 480 or even just 600 direct. I think it's definitely still a solid gear ratio, definitely viable, and I do like the layout of 450 RPM, so I think this deserves A tier. Next is 3.25-inch 480. Again, very similar things that I said about the 3.25-inch 450 and the 2.75-inch 480, so I think this also gets an A tier. Now, moving on to the 4-inch wheels, we have 257 RPM. This is a pretty easy layout to be able to do, 36 to 84. So it's pretty easy to do spacing wise. It all comes in low strength. However, this is definitely on the slower side. I wouldn't recommend running anything slower than this for a competitive robot, and the 4-inch wheels also make it a little bit bulkier. The spacing on it's pretty good if you want to do a smaller drive, but again, this is very much on the slower side. Good for high torque, maybe a game like Tower Takeover where you need that extra weight, but still not the best ratio. I think this deserves B tier. Next we have 4-inch wheels on 280 RPM. This is 84-tooth gear to 60-tooth gear on green motors. So again, you're going to be gearing it up for speed, so you're going to have the issue of spacing if you want to do a climbing thing. And the speed for this isn't very good. You would probably be better off running something like 3.25-inch 360, because this gear ratio can get very bulky. You really can't do 6-motor drive on this because stacking is way too big and you don't have the space to be able to do this. So I think this deserves D tier. Next is 4-inch wheels on 300 RPM. This is a pretty solid gear ratio, 36 to 72, and the 72 tooth gears can mesh inside of the 4-inch wheels, so it's pretty easy to get a 3-hole gap on. You can also get very high clearance with it if you build it right, due to them 36 and 72 being offset by a 1/4 inch. So this one, very high clearance, it's a good speed. I think it's deserving of A tier just because I'm not a huge fan of the 4-inch wheels. If you want to check out why, you can check out the wheel tier list. And 4-inch, 343 RPM, again, very similar to 300. This one is 48 to 84 tooth gears, pretty solid gear ratio. It's a little bit bigger than 300 RPM, but definitely still very similar. I don't have any complaints about it. I ran it. It's definitely on the faster side, but still viable for sure. So I think A tier. Okay, going back through editing, there are a couple of changes I want to make to this tier list. I think I was too generous on the 4-inch wheels, especially the 257. 257 is just way too slow of a gear ratio to be viable, so I think that gets bumped down to C tier. And then 300 and 343, just the bulkiness of the 4-inch wheels, which, like I said, I mentioned a lot in my wheel tier list, I think just weighs them down too much, so I'm going to bump both of those down to B tier. And then F tier needs other, because all of the other gear ratios and wheel sizes combinations suck, because they're either going to have a bunch of unnecessary idler gears, they're going to be too fast, or they're going to be too slow. I think that wraps it up for this video. If you have any questions or feedback you would like to provide, feel free to leave that in the comments below. Thanks for watching.